I know what you're thinking. Y2K? That horse? Really, Nanny? I don't even really have an excuse for it, neither a reason for my timing. The fact is that this is a topic I've been meaning to talk about, but never really quite found the right way to do so until now. So this is what we're doing now. And yes, I'm aware this video is going to get about 20 views at best, but my channel has never especially been charming to the algorithm anyway, so who the flippity flop even cares at this point? Let's take a super delayed look at one incredibly specific aspect of the Y2K controversy and discuss why it was probably not especially warranted, using a game beloved by many as a counterexample. Sorry, yet anonymous game beloved by many. But as with most things, this is a story that really needs to be told from the beginning to be understood. So on the off chance that you don't know what Y2K, a postmodern RPG is, and are yet still somehow watching this video, let's begin with... Once upon a time, in 2012, the dedicated writer and composer of small indie developer YIIK Studios, Andrew Allenson, had an idea. He, a fan of postmodern literature, decided to make a game inspired by the style, themes, and character tropes of postmodern literature. This project quickly manifested as Y2K, a postmodern RPG, a game that, following an occasionally troubled development, would take 6 years to develop and eventually release on January 17th, 2019. Prior to the release, the game already had a cult following excited to play it. YIIK Studios had done a great job drumming up hype for the game's Earthbound-inspired aesthetic, a design choice that tends to be popular with indie RPGs, its soundtrack, and the short bits of character and plot known to that point. Then the game was released. Initial reception was mixed. Some people highly praised the writing, voice acting and art style, while others found them atrocious. However, all players were somewhat united in feeling that the gameplay was more than just a little rough around the edges, leading to especially battles and leveling up becoming a gratingly tedious experience for most. It was perhaps the sense of disappointed hype that motivated what, according to the writer and director, was the first minor outcry around the game, centering around alleged instances of pedophilia in the game, which definitely aren't actually present. However, with that first domino rolling, the scandals quickly kept piling up, from gameplay problems, to game-breaking programming oversights, to writing oversights that made the staff seem insensitive, to awkward prose and weird tone shifts in the writing, to finally the revelation that the game's entire plot is based on the death of a real person who accidentally drowned herself in what is assumed to have been an hallucinatory fit. Yikes! The more time passed, the more unfortunate information seemed to be revealed about the game, and by the middle of February, what first started out as a somewhat disappointing, mediocre indie RPG had become one of the internet's favorite punching bags in 2019, probably to an extent that was not entirely warranted. I admittedly haven't personally played the game myself, but from the 20-hour playthrough that I have watched, I can confirm that while it wasn't exactly a contender for Game of the Year 2019, and a lot of the writing choices are more than just a little ode to questionable, it isn't quite the literal spawn of Satan the internet, including myself, gleefully tried to make it out as back last year. We've seen worse. Heck, there was worse released that very year. Considering this came out of a small indie studio that seems to consist of only a handful of people, and Steam has released an actual gay genocide simulator and slave Tetris before, this could have been a lot worse than the clumsy but definitely sincere attempt at psychological storytelling that we got. Still, even if it was all exaggerated to a point, most of the major controversies were rooted in truth. The game was initially released with a prompt to identify yourself by the name given to you by your parents, which ended up being quite insulting to players who had legally changed their names for various reasons. The prose was clumsy and intrusive, the gameplay was slow and sometimes hard to sit through, one boss battle did have a bug that made it almost impossible to beat it on your first couple of tries without a guide, there was a conspicuous Satoru Iwata gravestone in the graveyard of the local slums, and yes, the writer outright stated that the plot of the game was, in fact, based on the tragic death of Eliza Lamb in 2013. So the critics and memes are still kind of right? I mean, a lot of it is overblown, of course, but there are some actual problems here and there that are actually worth being discussed and kinda sorta being made fun of, right? That's the opinion I had. And then it started. As mentioned at the start of the previous section, Eliza Lam's case wasn't Andrew Allinson's only inspiration for the plot and characters of Y2K. His other major inspiration was postmodern literature, most strikingly the writings and stories of Japanese novelist Murakami Haruki, of whose themes and prose, well, actually the prose of his translators, because Japanese prose and English prose are very different, but we'll get into that, Y2K borrows a lot. I'm a bit of a fan of Murakami myself, and while I've only read a couple of his books, his influence was immediately apparent to me in Y2K. The uncomfortable atmosphere, the striking, often psychedelic visuals, the overly purple way the protagonist's inner monologue tends to pan out, those are all elements Allinson borrows from Murakami. Now, the question of how well he executes these elements is up to your own discretion, but the writer definitely did not make a secret of his influences here. So I absolutely was not surprised when a direct quote from one of Murakami's books, After Dark, showed up in the game's dialogue. What I was surprised about was how the internet reacted to it. Y2K, a postmodern RPG accused of plagiarizing Japanese author Haruki Murakami, says PlayStation Lifestyle. Indie developer accused of plagiarism, Kotaku calls X Studios. An indie RPG caught stealing for his game. Wait, his game? What? That doesn't even make sense. Anyway, that's what YouTuber Dreamcast guy says. The memes are plentiful, the shade is thrown, people point out cases of the game quoting the freaking dictionary too. And once again, Y2K finds itself in another seemingly deserved storm of fiery bashing. Kotaku puts special attention on the fact that even if Allinson meant the quote to be a reference to Murakami rather than stealing from him, he never actually sourced the quote, technically making it bad, I guess.
This is not taking inspiration, this is not using specific cues, this is him taking lines out of the book, literally and directly, and just shoving them in the game.
For a time, I tried to make myself agree with these sentiments. I mean, yeah, Allinson did directly take Murakami's text and didn't cite the quote at all either, so maybe the vitriol is warranted,
But this stuff specifically is what we know for a fact is not allowed. This is literal, textbook definition plagiarism. Now what's going to happen? To be honest, I actually think that there is a good chance that his game may get taken off the internet.
The thing is, Undertale did it first. Yeah, the entire time this controversy was a thing, nobody ever talked about this, but Y2K wasn't the first 2010s Western indie RPG with Earthbound influences and Toby Fox music that directly quotes lines from a Japanese postmodern novel without ever sourcing the quote. Given Undertale's example isn't quite as, overt as Y2K's, but yeah, it's there. You can't deny it, it's there. During the game's infamous genocide route, I know that's not the route's official name, I'm calling it that anyway, shut up, the player eventually comes across the characters Royal Guard 1 and Royal Guard 2, an armored knight duo consisting of a buff bunny and a dragon. In the game's more peaceful story path, your objective in this battle is to make Royal Guard 1 confess his secret crush on Royal Guard 2 and play wingman for him, getting the two of them to ultimately hook up. Now, in genocide, as with everyone else, you're just trying to stab them to death, but their status as a potential couple is still very much relevant. And I don't just mean in how either of them goes berserk against you if one of them is killed. People rarely actually make use of the turn-wasting check function during the genocide runs, but if you do this in this battle, the Royal Guards are described as I see two lovers staring over the edge of the cauldron of hell. Do they both wish for death? That means their love will end in hell. I couldn't stop laughing. The This is a direct quote from the English translation of Yoshimoto Banana's 1988 novel Kitchen. In Kitchen, this section appears after the death of Erdiko, the transgender mother of the protagonist's love interest, puts the leading couple into a dangerous social and financial situation, causing them to look towards an unsure future together. The English translation reads, "Although I had been earnestly daydreaming until then, I suddenly started to laugh. I see two lovers looking over the edge of the cauldron of hell. Are they contemplating a double suicide? This means their love will end in hell. I couldn't stop laughing. I was certainly no fortune teller." This is really not that different from what Y2K did with After Dark. A few words are different here and there, yeah, but it's the same quote. The same ominous piece of prose. And I'm not the first person playing Undertale to notice this either. Both the blog Summer Reading List at the End of the World and several Undertale theory blogs on Tumblr pointed out the quote and its origins as early as the game's release year of 2015. But, unlike Y2K, which was immediately mocked and derided for featuring a quote from a Japanese author's work, the response to Undertale's quote of Kitchen was positive. Some people even used it in combination with the popular theory that the narrator of the game is the posthumous character Kara, and tried to derive parts of their characterization from their knowledge of the quote. So when Y2K does it, it's an immoral crime worthy of scorn and threat of legal action, but when Undertale does it, it's a brilliant, subtle way of establishing a dead character's literary preferences? I'm not saying Undertale should have gotten flack for this. I'm just asking you all the question that I asked myself when I realized this. Why did we treat quoting a novel as an unforgivable crime when Y2K did it, when just a couple years before it was a good thing when Undertale did it? Why were we immediately compelled to feel something negative about Allinson's quoting, when Toby Fox's quoting just made us go, "Oh, cool"? And I know, the answer to this question might seem obvious, but I still think we should take a long, hard look at it, because it really caused me a minor existential crisis there. I, along with everybody else shitting on Y2K over this, while knowing about both quotes, was undeniably holding a double standard there. And I was not sure how to justify that to myself. I'm still not sure, but I've at least tried to make sense of it. And that's why I'm here. My first instinct in my quest to figure out how Undertale's quote of Yoshimoto is different from Y2K's plagiarism of Murakami was to take a look at how the quite sizable Japanese fanbase of Undertale reacted to this quote of Yoshimoto Banana. This attempt of mine was quickly thwarted by the fact that the quote was utterly lost in translation. Mostly because Undertale's Japanese translator, Fukuichi Keiko, translated the text back into Japanese exactly how Toby had quoted it, when the original quote in Kitchen before translation actually looks a bit more like this. "I'm really no fortune teller, am I now? I had been earnestly daydreaming until that point, but that was when I suddenly had to laugh without meaning to. Right, I could see them clearly, that man and woman peering into the center of the cauldron of hell, huh? I guess their whole laugh is damned to hell then. I was thinking about that and how cliché it was, as I just kept laughing, unable to stop myself." That is pretty different from the fairly old English translation Toby Fox quoted. So when the quote was translated back into Japanese with an Undertale, keeping the wording Toby quoted pretty much consistent, it ended up looking very different from its counterpart in the original novel, which certainly would have obscured the fact that it even was a Yoshimoto quote to begin with for most Japanese players of the game, even those familiar with Yoshimoto's work. But why? I know, this seems like a tangent, but when Toby Fox ordered the translation from Fukuichi Keiko, why didn't he make sure that she understood where the quote came from and modeled her translation of it after the original Japanese version of the novel? It's not like there was no communication between Fox and Fukuichi during the translation process. He personally had input in the role language the characters use, he clarified the meaning of terminology, heck, he even made sure that Susie and Susie would be spelled differently between Undertale and Deltarune. So why in the name of everything that is localized and holy did Fox not make sure that Fukuichi would keep the Yoshimoto quote as, well, a Yoshimoto quote? And this brings us to a tweet that I think is important to the overall thesis of this video. In general, I think references are okay as long as the material stands on its own, without knowledge of the source material. This is Toby Fox, talking about referencing other works in September 2015 on his Twitter. And I think that's the magic key to unraveling my confusion here. Undertale's quote of Yoshimoto was never questioned because it works. It's creepy and ominous, yes, but not any more creepy or ominous than all the other weird, disturbing stuff that happens in the genocide route. That's why it doesn't need to still be a Yoshimoto quote when it's translated back to Japanese, because even if it isn't, it still works. It doesn't disrupt the flow, doesn't come out of nowhere, it fits the situation and it feels almost natural at this point of the game. Nobody would ever even consider Toby Fox might have put this quote in to elevate his own writing. It doesn't stand out as better or worse written than most of the other lines in this route of the game. It's just there, part of the prose. It stands on its own. And this brings me back to something I may have mentioned a couple of times before in the script. What was it again? Oh yeah, this game's amazingly awkward prose. I've held back on this and tried to stay neutral, but really, listen to this.
I stepped into the elevator, expecting to find the cat. I scanned the dark floor and found nothing. I sighed as the elevator began to shake, vibrating with motion. The elevator came to a smooth but unexpected stop. I cringed with anxiety as the lights flickered. Please don't die, please don't die. I pleaded with the mechanical gods to keep the power on. My prayers weren't answered.
When Semi left your reality, I entered. Before that, this physical form was destroyed, captured, and held prisoner by the two entities that you just defeated in combat. Ever since then, I had tried to return, but as my physical form still held trace amounts of my consciousness, I had to wait until Semi, this reality's version of me, died or escaped into the soul space.
The truth is, I'm not original. Everything I have to say that you found interesting has been said before. This is just the first time you've heard it. I am a quote machine. I string things together smarter people have said to make myself appear to have value. I'm the definition of pretentious.
Don't you think that this maybe, just maybe is the real problem with the quote, rather than the idea that it's plagiarism? Just maybe. In Y2K, when Murakami's quote shows up, it doesn't melt into the rest of the prose seamlessly. It doesn't supplement what is happening around it. It doesn't support what is happening. It just happens. Suddenly, without warning. It sticks out like a sore thumb. Or rather, like an undamaged thumb on a handful of otherwise sore thumbs, I guess? Point being, it just doesn't stand on its own. If references are okay as long as the material stands on its own without knowledge of the source material, then, for many players, this quote simply isn't okay. Unlike Undertale, where the canonical reason for the Yoshimoto quote is only being speculated on by fans, there is an in-universe explanation for the Murakami quote in Y2K that the author has confirmed. Namely that Alex is a deeply pretentious person who quotes Murakami to himself in his own head to make himself feel cooler. This is supposed to serve as the first hint to the fact that a lot of what happens within the game is actually tied to his mental state, and in another game, that might have worked. But Y2K was already in way too deep. Too deep in its own clumsy prose, too deep in game design choices that made players not want to give it the benefit of the doubt, too deep in its mountain of previous controversies. By the time players found the Murakami quote, Y2K's fate was already sealed. Yes, the plagiarism controversy wasn't warranted. We players did judge Y2K with an unfair double standard there. And it's actually a testimony to Andrew Allinson's maturity that he went back and added a dedication to Murakami in the credits as soon as the story broke. But there's a reason for this double standard. Y2K invited us into a spiral of ridicule and negativity. By the time the Murakami quote appeared, people were already in the general mindset that Y2K is just bad, period. And good authors being quoted in quote-unquote bad texts is generally, and often wrongly, seen by the general public as a form of mockery. People at this point wanted to have more reasons to dislike Y2K. They wanted to be angry at it. And they wanted to continue making memes of how angry they are about its genuine failings. The Murakami quote was just a casualty of that. At this point, I'd like to state that I am not advocating for plagiarism. Some of you might know that I come from academia and am currently writing on my own master's thesis. My university, as most others, takes plagiarism very, very seriously, and we absolutely do not approve of unsourced citations, let alone passing off someone else's work as your own. That said, I've even consulted with my literature and culture sciences professor on this, and we both agree that what is happening in the cases of Y2K and Undertale isn't plagiarism. These are homages. Simple as that. They're common in the literary world and generally not frowned upon. Is it polite to leave a dedication to something you quoted in your book? Yes, but that doesn't mean that you're actively breaking the law or sullying another author's work by borrowing a couple of sentences to make the reader stop and think, oh, that's right, I read After Dark the other day. No ideas are stolen, the author's original works aren't disgraced, and their profits aren't being cut into. If this was a crime, every Harry Potter fan who's ever quoted Dumbledore without directly stating where the quote is from would be liable for plagiarism. Things aren't quite that clear-cut, you know. Context plays a huge role. So no, contrary to what you may have heard about, Y2K's use of uncited Murakami quotes is not, in fact, something most authors would sue over. However, the controversy around this still has a meaning, because it is deeply revealing about how easy it is to get dragged down the hate rabbit hole these days.
Because I was thinking, I read the whole thing about plagiarism. This game got accused of plagiarism, and so I looked into it, and basically the plagiarism that it did was it quoted a book at some point in the dialogue. It's like, if you've ever read a book or even watched a movie, yeah, like literary allusions aren't uncommon, so that just felt like a really weird criticism, especially considering the sheer number of like genuinely good criticism. Like there's a lot of genuine criticisms I feel you can make about this game, but to accuse them of plagiarism I just feel like is a bit too far.
But, Jack, the genuine criticism is why we all ended up falling for the plagiarism controversy. In April of 2019, Andrew Allison, writer, composer and director of Y2K, infamously made the following statement. My mistake was thinking that video games are art. I wanted to make a game about a guy who's a piece of shit, unlikable character, who by the end of the game has to transform. But to many gamers, when they look at this, they immediately get triggered by it. So the thing is, games aren't art. They're toys for children, and it's considered in bad form to talk about anything meaningful, impactful, or thought-provoking. Yeah. Doesn't exactly cast his way of dealing with criticism in the best light now, does it? In a conversation with a journalist, Allinson later claimed that by this he didn't mean to say that video games aren't art, but rather that players don't treat them like art, therefore limiting the medium to being treated like a toy. This doesn't exactly help his case either. Because, even if Allinson doesn't seem to realize it, the problem with the statement was never that it is wrong to call video games not art. For the record, they are art. But his use of the term art as a defense from criticism. It's not considered bad form to use video games to tackle serious subject matters, Andrew. If that were true, plenty of successful games of the recent years simply wouldn't have succeeded. What is in bad form is to call gamers triggered by meaningful, impactful and thought-provoking content in response to their criticism of your work. Because blanket assuming malice or a lack of intelligence from an entire group at once is a surefire way to turn this entire group against you. Y2K has real issues, traits that make the game so much less engaging than it deserves to be and that leave players unsatisfied. But by the time half of the controversies happened, none of the real issues even really mattered anymore. Because the moment Allenson claimed that the only reason players don't like his game is because it's art, he made it personal. This quote, and the person who said it, became the only things about Y2K that really mattered. The only reason anyone needed to hate the game and continue to be down onto it repeatedly with enthusiasm. It started with people being genuinely disappointed about a game they had been looking forward to and voicing that disappointment. But once the anger directed at Y2K stopped being about the game itself and became much more about Andrew Allenson, the criticism leveled against the game became a lot less legitimate as well. Aside from the plagiarism controversy, people also started insulting the game by calling the main character a self-insert Gary Stu, which is patently untrue. By the way, that's not Andrew Allenson. That's a cosplayer. Or by deriding the game's soundtrack as terrible and calling Toby Fox's contribution the only good song in the game, which is like... Come on, you guys. That is really stretching it. And yes, for a while I was on that train too, readily accepting any complaint I could find about Y2K without critically examining it because it was just fun. I liked hating Y2K because it had come to stand for something, a sort of mindset I despised and that I really enjoyed separating myself from by ridiculing it as much as possible. So I embraced all of it, the memes, the rants, the common use of the game's name as a punchline without critically reflecting on any of it. I don't really want to name any specific cases. But this is something I see happening more and more on the internet these days. People getting so focused on hating and making fun of something or someone because of one incident that they want to see every new piece of information about this thing or person as just as bad and worthy of ridicule as the initial incident, even if it objectively doesn't add anything new to the conversation. Every little thing becomes meme fodder, and any chance for the people involved to redeem themselves even slightly in the eyes of the public ceases to exist. And is that really what we should be buying into? After all, the point of criticism is to help people improve, to learn from their mistakes and get better, right? If we never give them a chance to improve ever again, what was the point of our criticism in the first place? I don't like Y2K. I don't think it is a good game, let alone a good story. But I feel I owe it and its creator an apology. I'm sorry, Andrew Allenson. I'm sorry, Y2K, a postmodern RPG. I was too mean to you. There are good things in this game. Genuinely well-written conversations, cool ideas, striking visuals, good music, fun characters. They're just buried under a mountain of clumsy decisions. But they're there, and they deserve to be acknowledged. It's not the first pop culture story to use Eliza Lamb's death in a questionable way. It's not the first game to have a protagonist whose actions make you wanna toss the console against the wall. And yes, the plagiarism controversy too was not legitimate. And forever buying into this culture of unquestioned and unreflected hatred and ridicule against the game that really only earned a specific portion of the flack that it got, I am sorry. And thus, I atone.